All right, so good morning, everybody. Today we're going to talk about our Illinois Class A CDL pre-trip. This is going to be for Part A. So you're encouraged, please, to write some of this stuff down. All right. And I'm telling you something, when you write it down, it reinforces everything in your head. So we're going to go through some of the stuff here, and I'm going to take you through the entire Part A pre-trip, and I'm going to show you kind of how I break it down to make it easy for you to remember. So let's talk about our blanket statements first, okay? These are the statements we use as soon as we identify a part before we say anything else about the part, okay? And you're going to repeat these and repeat these and repeat these, but it's okay. We hope that you'll bore the examiner to death, and they'll just, get you rocking and rolling right through it. So let's talk about first, when we talk about any lights, okay? The first, if you can see down here, the first 4 words out of our mouth, okay, are always properly mounted and secured for everything. Lights, metal parts, rubber parts, plastic parts. I am properly mounted and secured to this chair. My computer's properly mounted and secured to the desk, and on and on. We get it. So lights, properly mounted and secured. They are not cracked or broken. There is no moisture behind the lenses, and they work. That's the full statement. Then we go into the description of what the light is for or anything else. Metal parts, such as gas or fuel tanks, frame parts, anything that's metal, first and foremost, properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, and no illegal welds. Any rubber parts, properly mounted and secured, soft and pliable, not cracked or dry rotted, and not leaking if applicable, such as if it is a hose, a tire can leak, which is rubber. You know what I'm saying? So we use a little common sense when we're talking about parts, but you'll get this once we go through these blanket statements. Any plastic parts such as reservoirs, maybe like a coolant reservoir, some power steering fluid reservoirs are plastic, so they're going to be properly mounted and secured, not cracked or broken. They're not metal, so they don't bend. So we say not cracked or broken and not leaking. And then we move on from there. Okay? So that's what we're going to start off with our blanket statements. I like to teach what I call the power of 3. Okay? This will help you break down at least the first entire half and a little more through of this Part A. Okay? Everything we do is kind of going to be in 3s. So I'll explain it. We're going to be talking about 3 different sets of lights for our pre-trip A. 3 spinny things, I like to call them. And my boss hates what I call them spinny things. But 3 spinny things. And then 3 liquids. 3, 3, and 3. That's already 9 entire things that we covered on Part A. We're almost close to halfway done after we get rid of those. So let's talk about the first thing. I'm going to start moving us into it right now, okay? First thing we're going to talk about are our lights. Now, if you take a look at the picture, we're going to be standing in front of the truck when we do this, okay? So the first lights we want to talk about are our identification lights. Now, remember, when you're explaining your pre-trip to anybody, such as an examiner, even when you're working it through, you have to explain it like they don't know anything about a truck and like they have a blindfold on. You need to paint a picture to the examiner for them so they know exactly what we're talking about. So let's look at these 3 identification lights. So I'm going to go ahead and start to explain this. In the middle of the truck, we have our 3 identification lights. They are properly mounted and secured, not cracked or broken. no moisture behind the lenses, and they are working. They are 3 amber lights in the center, and they signify the vehicle is up to 8 feet wide, or minimum 8 feet wide. Then we're going to move on to part 2 of the lights, okay, is our clearance lights. So I have my 2 clearance lights, one on either side of the vehicle, amber in color. They are properly mounted and secured, not cracked or broken, no moisture behind the lenses, and they are working. They signify the vehicle is up to 13 feet 6 inches high. Last but not least, on that power of 3, our third light that we have to talk about is the headlight assembly. Notice we have our headlight assembly is properly mounted and secured, not cracked or broken, no moisture behind the lenses, the lights are working. We have a low beam, a high beam, and a 4-function amber light. The 4 functions of the amber light are parking, running, turning, and hazard, or 4-way, whichever you'd like to say. You can see in the picture the arrow is pointing to the 4-function amber light. Okay, power of 3s, that's our first. All 3 of those lights are done. Okay, now we move on to our spinny things. Okay, this is going under the hood now. Okay, and the pictures I'm using are mostly from a Freightliner Cascadia, not all of them, most of them. Again, I want to tell you that the parts we're seeing in the pictures may not be in the exact location we're seeing them here, depending on the truck that you're testing on. Most everyone tests on a Freightliner. So on the Freightliner, on the passenger side under the hood is where you'll usually see the belt-driven alternator. Now, notice it doesn't say alternator, okay? It says belt-driven alternator, and that's the proper name of this part for testing purposes, all right? We can see the alternator in the picture has a belt around the front of it, all right? And look on the side of it, you can see wires, okay, screwed into the back of it and screwed into the side of it. That's how you're going to know that that's an alternator. So let's pre-trip this alternator. So I have my belt-driven alternator, and it is what? Say it with me, please. Properly mounted and secured. Not cracked, bent, broken, no illegal welds. Okay. Now look at what I have on the slide, okay? The wiring, okay? We need to talk about everything that's on that part. So the wiring is in good condition. We have no exposed, burned, or frayed wires. And then we need to talk about the belt. The belt should not be cracked, dry rotted, or torn, and have no more than 1/4 inch free play when pressed in the center. Okay, now we've got a bunch of parts. Some should have no more than, some should have no less than. Okay, we need to learn the difference of that. I find when I teach, and I am actually an instructor, just so we all know. I teach at a very big driving school, and I specialize in pre-trip. So the belt, okay, again, needs to be pre-trip, but the no more than versus the no less than. When we say no more than 1/4 inch free play, that means we're only giving this part a very little room to move. We want that belt tight, okay? We don't want it to have any more than 1/4 inch free play. We don't want it flopping all around, all right? So that's our belt-driven alternator. That's part 1 of 3 on the spinny things. The second of the 3 spinny things we have to talk about is a belt-driven water pump, okay? The belt-driven water pump you are most likely not going to be able to see. If we look in the picture, that part right up front with the silver and the belt going around it, that is a belt-driven water pump. You can see that that piece in blue in the picture is actually for the engine fan, which sits smack dab in the center of the engine. So we know when we're looking for the belt-driven water pump, we need to really look down in towards the center of that engine near the fan, and it has a belt around it, okay? And it should have some hoses coming out of it. When you get rolling with this, or you get to your school or into the yard where you're practicing this, you'll have somebody point it out to you if you can see it. But let's pre-trip the belt-driven water pump, and you're going to be saying these first 4 words with me, okay? So we have our belt-driven water pump. It is, say it with me please, properly mounted and secured. Not cracked, bent, or broken. It is a metal part, no illegal welds, okay? And it is not leaking any coolant. All right, that part can leak. You see to the right of that belt on there, there are bolts that hold it, and there's a gasket in there. It can leak, so it is not leaking any coolant. There are hoses attached to it. We need to talk about those. All hoses associated with it are not leaking any coolant, but we'll say the blanket statement. All hoses associated with it should be soft and pliable, not cracked or dry rotted, and not leaking any coolant. Then we need to talk about the belt. The belt should not be cracked, dry rotted, torn, and have no more than 1/4 inch free play when pressed in the center. Okay? That covers our water pump. The last spinny thing we're going to talk about, and this is also on the driver's side of the engine compartment, is going to be our gear-driven air compressor. Okay? All 3 of these things spin. A belt spins the alternator, a belt spins the water pump, and the air compressor is gear driven, but it spins, okay? Now, if we look in the picture, okay, we cannot actually physically see the air compressor in a lot of the trucks. Usually they're tucked under the frame. What is circled in yellow are the hoses that come from the air compressor. And if you follow them down, they will actually run under the frame. Okay, so when we're talking about the air compressor, we're going to point down in there and say we can't actually see it, but, okay, so let's pre-trip this gear-driven air compressor. All right, so I have a gear-driven air compressor. It is, say it with me please, properly mounted and secured. Not cracked, bent, broken, no illegal welds, and it is not leaking any air. All right. Any hoses associated with it, as you can see the hoses in yellow, any hoses associated with it are soft and pliable, not cracked, not dry rotted, not leaking any air. Okay? And that covers it. So we did 3 lights, 3 spinny things. Now the last thing we have to work with is 3 liquids. Okay? Again, the coolant reservoir that we're going to talk about, if you look at it, it's circled in yellow. It is a plastic part. Okay, we're going to use our plastic blanket statement for that. Most likely, coolant reservoirs can be in different places on trucks, but most likely you'll see it. The way to tell that it's a coolant reservoir, okay, 1, you'll look on the cap on the top of it. It should say coolant. And 2, if you notice in this one, it has orange fluid in it, or orange colored coolant. Most trucks use orange colored coolant. Okay, so that's how we identify. Now, the reason we're going through this so in depth in this part here is with pictures and stuff is because we need to be able to point and identify each part that we're speaking on. So we can memorize a script, that's fine, but when the examiner asks, show me a leaf spring, and you're pointing to a pitman arm or a drag link or something like that, you know, that raises red flags in the examiner's head. So we don't want to do that. We want to go in to our testing and we want the examiner to know, hey, this person knows exactly what they're talking about. They know all the parts, and it gives the examiner confidence, you know, to move you on. An examiner is not there for the sole purpose of giving you a CDL license. Okay, the purpose of an examiner, I mean, is to check for deficiencies. I don't want to say that they're really looking to fail you like I like to scare my classes with, but you know, they're not just going to say, here's a license, have at it. I mean, they want to know you know what you're talking about. And if you go in there at 110%, okay, factor in for nerves, factor in for, you know, anything else, you should be at least 98% when you start doing all this. And that's fantastic, you know. So let's talk about this coolant reservoir. Say it with me, please. Coolant reservoir is, what are we saying it is? Properly mounted and secured, okay? Not cracked or broken, not leaking any coolant. All caps are present and tight. We can see caps on the side and on the top of it. All right. All hoses associated with it are what? They are rubber. They are soft and pliable, not cracked, not dry rotted, not leaking any coolant. It should be filled to the proper level or above the add and below the max. Okay? Moving on. Our second part of 3 on liquids. We then have a power steering fluid reservoir. Okay, power steering, it should be fluid reservoir. You can see that it is circled in yellow. Okay, it is on the driver's side of the engine compartment. You can see a blue hose going out of it, out of the top of it. Okay. The way you can tell that that's a power steering fluid reservoir, if you're unsure, is to read the cap where the blue arrow is pointed. Okay, it will say power steering fluid on it. So everything you need to pretty much know with these, you can pretty much read and it tells you on these reservoirs. So let's pre-trip this power steering fluid reservoir. Okay, we have a power steering fluid reservoir. It is, say it with me please, properly mounted and secured. Not cracked or broken, and not leaking any power steering fluid. All caps are present and tight. All hoses associated with it are soft and pliable, not cracked or dry rotted, and not leaking any power steering fluid. The power steering fluid reservoir itself, if I didn't say it, was not leaking any power steering fluid. Okay, it should be filled to the proper level or above add and below max. You check that by removing the cap. There's a little dipstick on the cap. I don't know if they're going to ask. I don't usually pre-trip that with my class. And last of the 3 liquids is going to be our oil dipstick. Okay. The oil dipstick is also most of the time on the driver's side. Okay, it's right, as you can see, above and to the right of the power steering fluid reservoir, and it usually has a yellow little grip handle on it. So we have our oil dipstick. It is properly mounted and secured, not cracked or broken. To check the oil, we remove the dipstick, wipe it off, reinsert, remove it again, and we read the dipstick. It should be above add and below max. Now, if we need to fill it, we fill with 1 gallon at a time to prevent overfilling, and we do this while the engine is cool. And right to the left of it, it's very hard to see in this picture, but there is an oil fill cap. Okay, you would point to the oil fill cap and say we would fill it here, and the cap is present and tight. So the power of 3s, 3 lights, 3 spinny things, and 3 liquids. We're just about halfway through with this section A. And when I'm done, I'm going to go ahead and run through the entire pre-trip again without all my narrative, just so you can kind of get the gist of how it works. You can actually see we're still in the same area when we start with our next pieces. Okay, we're not moving around this truck very much at all. It usually will start at the front with our lights. Sometimes the alternator and the coolant reservoir is on the passenger side, okay? But the way I have this broken down, it's once we get to the driver's side, everything is there. So from when we're done with our oil dipstick, we'll move on to our steering, okay? So we start off with the steering shaft. You can see the arrows pointing directly to the steering shaft. It is a round shaft. It comes out of the firewall and connects down into our steering gearbox. Okay, it connects to a U-joint, which goes to the gearbox. So let's pre-trip the steering shaft. Now, everything I'm telling you when I'm pre-tripping this, okay, needs to be said. That's why you need to be taking notes. All right, I'm not going to say very much, and you'll hear it when I do it at the end. I'll go back over it from the end. So let's pre-trip the steering shaft. So we have our steering shaft. It is properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, broken, and it is metal part, so we say no illegal welds. Okay, it is secured with a U-joint that should be well greased. Okay, the U-joint is the blue arrow that we see down there. All right, that takes care of 2 of the parts, and then it is connected. Then we have our steering gearbox, which is the red arrow. Okay, the steering gearbox is properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, broken, no illegal welds, and not leaking any steering fluid. Now you see there's a hose that goes from the reservoir to that gearbox. Okay, so any hoses associated with it are soft and pliable, not cracked or dry rotted, and not leaking any power steering fluid. Okay. That's the first part. That's 3. Steering shaft, U-joint, and gearbox. Now we move on. And here's an expanded view so we can actually see the steering shaft in yellow. Look at the U-joint. That's what the steering shaft connects. Okay, now we have U-joints and U-bolts. We don't want to mix things up here. Okay, U-joints are movable. So this is a U-joint. They all pretty much look the same. They're just, some are bigger, some are smaller. All right, and there's our gearbox. So let's move on now to our steering linkage, okay? And that's right in the exact same area. It's just down a little bit, okay? If you look at your red arrow, if we just move a little bit over to the left, that is starting with our pitman arm, which is the yellow arrow on the other screen here, all right? So we have 4 pieces we have to talk about on our steering linkage. We start with our pitman arm, okay? Now, we can lump these. You see how there's a bracket on your slide lumping all these 4 together. So when we pre-trip these, we can actually lump them together when we pre-trip them. So let's go ahead and let's pre-trip them. So next I have my steering linkage. I have my pitman arm, my drag link, my steer arm, and my tie rod. They are all properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, and no illegal welds. They are secured with a castle nut and cotter pin, and all joints are well greased. Okay, the colors are corresponding with each part. The pitman arm has the yellow arrow. The drag link has the blue. That goes from the pitman arm to the steer arm. Okay, the steer arm is the purple arrow. And the tie rod, the orange arrow, I have 2 of them. It goes from the lower steer arm, actually, all the way across to the other steer tire. It's a round rod. It's kind of hard to see in this picture. It's a round rod, but it goes all the way across from tire to tire. So that's your tie rod. The castle nut and cotter pin, if you look at your yellow arrow, the very bottom of your yellow arrow, that is a castle nut. It's that round nut. If you look at it, it kind of looks like the top of a castle. And the cotter pin, you can kind of see it kind of dangling there. That goes through it. So that's what a castle nut and a cotter pin is. Okay. Let's move on. Next, so we've covered all the steering. There's not a whole heck of a lot left to cover here. Okay. So the next thing we're going to talk about is our suspension. Okay. Now, I've lumped our front spring hanger, our rear spring hanger, and our rear spring shackle all together because we're going to pre-trip it together straight away. All right. So our front spring hanger, rear spring hanger, and rear spring shackle are all properly mounted and secured. Not cracked, bent, broken, and no illegal welds. All right. That covers most of it. It's just we need to know where they're at. Again, yellow is our front spring hanger. It's a spring hanger. It hangs a spring. So if you're in doubt, look for your leaf spring, which we'll show you where that's at if you don't know shortly here. And look to the front of the leaf spring and then look to the rear of the leaf spring. You can't go wrong. Even if you're pointing and you're just a hair off, okay, they'll probably accept it. But our front spring hanger is in yellow. Our rear spring hanger is the red arrow. And the spring shackle is a metal plate. It's kind of hard to see. That kind of connects. It has 2 bolts coming through it, 2 nuts. So it kind of connects everything together back there. That's the rear spring shackle. All right. So, you know, when I first started teaching this CDL, I was teaching strictly by the script. I would have everyone memorize this because if you can memorize it without getting in front of a truck, when you get in front of the truck, you should not have a problem. However, we came into a problem when it came to pointing and identifying different parts. Okay, so that's why we've switched it all up and around, and we make sure now that everyone knows where every part is. All right, let's look at the rest of the suspension. Our main leaf spring, okay, is properly mounted and secured. It is not cracked, bent, broken, no illegal welds. That is highlighted in blue with the arrows. Okay, from our leaf spring we have our U-bolt. The leaf spring is secured with a U-bolt. The path of the U-bolt, and we need to know this, so this definitely we need to write down. The path of the U-bolt goes over the saddle, around the leaf spring, and through the steer axle. You can see those yellow arrows. This was the best picture I could find. But that U-bolt, you can see it goes over the saddle. There's like right to the right of the arrows. You can see like a little hump. It's kind of like right under that left red arrow. That is actually the saddle. The saddle is kind of like a top brace plate almost. So, and there's another U-bolt just to the right of the one where the arrows are pointing. So there's actually two U-bolts there. So the path of the U-bolt once again goes over the saddle, around the leaf spring, and through the steer axle, secured with nuts. Okay. And last but not least, we have our hydraulic shock absorber. Now, we need to know all this with the hydraulic shock absorber. It's not on the slide because I wanted to get kind of a bigger picture of the suspension. So let's pre-trip this hydraulic shock absorber. It is, you see the red arrows pointing to it. The hydraulic shock absorber is properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, no illegal welds, and it is not leaking any hydraulic oil. Okay. It is secured at the top and bottom with nuts, bolts, and rubber bushings. The rubber bushings are soft and pliable, not cracked or dry rotted. Okay, you can see that shock absorber on the top and bottom where it bolts in. You see the bolts. Okay, the rubber bushings are kind of in between there. So that takes care of all of our suspension. So we can recap. All right, front spring hanger, rear spring shackle, all properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, broken, no illegal welds. Have a main leaf spring, properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, broken, no illegal welds. Secured with a U-bolt. The path of the U-bolt goes over the saddle, around the spring, and through the steer axle, secured with nuts. We have our hydraulic shock absorber, properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, broken, no illegal welds. It is secured at the top and bottom with nuts, bolts, and rubber bushings. The rubber bushings should be soft and pliable. It should not be leaking any hydraulic fluid. That covers our suspension, all right? We don't have a heck of a lot left here, okay? We're going to talk about brakes, and you notice we're still in the same area. Look at the picture. What do you see in the picture that we've talked about already? I can see the power steering gearbox. I see the pitman arm, the drag link. I see our suspension. I see the shock absorber. So we're still in the same area. All right, everything is there. Now you see that we're looking at the brakes. The brakes are next, okay? Now, we're going to start off by talking about the brake chamber. Let me see what we got here. The brake chamber is the black arrow, okay? So we have our brake chamber, which is properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, broken, and not leaking any what? Most people are going to say brake fluid, okay? We have to remember these are air brakes, okay? Air is what powers the brakes, all right? So not leaking any air. Now, if we look at the red arrow up top, that is the air supply hose, okay? So we have to say any hoses associated with it are soft and pliable, not cracked or dry rotted, and not leaking any air, okay? Next, we have our push rod, which is the blue arrow. It's kind of hard to see exactly where the push rod is, but if you look at the very tip of that blue arrow and kind of trace that part, it looks like a fork almost. It's a fork, and the slack adjuster is going through the fork. Okay, so that fork is what we call the push rod. And if you look at your brake chamber that has the black arrow, if we kind of look at the front of it near that push rod, you can kind of see where the rod goes into that chamber. The push rod pushes out of that chamber, okay? That's why it's a push rod. So you can lump your push rod and your slack adjuster, which is the blue and the yellow. You can lump those together when we talk about them. So we'll pre-trip. Let me start and I'll pre-trip the entire brake system again, at least the first half of it. Next, we have our brakes. We have our brake chamber, which is properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, broken. No illegal welds, not leaking any air. All hoses associated with it are soft and pliable, not cracked or dry rotted, also not leaking any air. Then we have our push rod and slack adjuster, properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, broken, no illegal welds. The slack adjuster should be well greased and have no more than 1 inch of free play with the wheels chocked and the brakes released. The last half of the brakes that we talk about are brake drum, and then the brake shoes and the brake linings. Now, brake drum is its own point, so we want to talk about that separately, okay? The brake drum is going to be on the inside of that tire, or in this case, we have brakes in section A, we have brakes in section B, and we have brakes in section C, okay? All the sections that you have to pre-trip have brakes, so if you know them for one, they're the exact same across the board. So here we're looking at a tandem tire, but it's the same as a steer tire, okay? We have our brake drum, which is the very tip of that black arrow is sitting on the brake drum. The brake drum is just that big steel drum, okay, that the shoes and the linings ride in, okay? So the drum, it's a round steel, all right? It spins. The shoes and the lining, if you look at the tip of that yellow arrow, okay, the very tip is just about on the shoes. The shoes is just that metal part that rivets the lining to it, okay? And the lining, you can see, rides on that drum. So those are basically your brake pads, all right? They just call it something different, but basically that's your brake pad. So the brake pads push against the drum, creating the friction to stop the vehicle. That's why they call the brake pads friction material, okay? So let's pre-trip the last half of the brake. So I have my brake drum is properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, broken, and no illegal welds. We have our brake shoes and brake lining. They are both properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, broken, no illegal welds. The brake lining should have no less than, okay, 1/4 of an inch of friction material. That means that they do not want you to start riding those brake pads to where there's none left, okay? You cannot do that. Once they get to 1/4 of an inch thick, you need to get new brakes. So they should have no less than 1/4 of an inch friction material. There should be no grease or oil on the inside of the drum or linings. This would indicate an inner axle seal leak. And our brakes are now done. Okay? Let's move on. Next thing we need to talk about is our steer tire. Okay? The steer tire, if you see right here, okay, is your front tire. All right, it is a steer tire because when we steer left or right, that is the tire that moves back and forth, okay, to turn the truck. Now, there's a bunch of caveats we have to talk about when it comes to the steer tire. All right, there's a bunch of things we need to know, and they're a little more strict on a steer tire than any other tire on the truck because they consider that a critical tire. You know, if you blow a steer tire, it can result in, you know, not too good of things happening, especially when you're tooling down the highway at 60, 70 miles an hour. You do not want to have a steer tire blowout. It just would not be fun. So let's pre-trip the steer tire. Now, obviously, the steer tire is rubber. Okay, so we go into that rubber blanket statement. So we have our steer tire. It is properly mounted and secured to the rims. Now, on this one, I always like to say it has no A, B's, and C's, okay? No abrasions, bulges, or cuts, and no exposed material on the sidewall, all right? It should have a minimum of 4/32 tread depth in all major grooves. That means that at 430 seconds of tread depth, once those tires start looking like they're going bald, you gotta have new tires, okay? A minimum of 430 seconds tread depth in all major grooves. Verbiage is very important when you're explaining this stuff. I cannot specify, I can't tell you guys how important verbiage is. A lot of my students will be like, it should have 430 seconds tread depth. So what does that mean? Does that mean that it can't have any more? Or does that mean that you have to buy that tire with only 430 seconds? So it should have a minimum of 430 seconds tread depth in all major groups. Okay, it cannot be a recapped tire. And we'll get into capping and recapping later. It has to be, when we replace the tire, it has to be a brand new tire, not recapped, okay? It must be the same size and type across the axle, filled to the manufacturer's specs, or between 100 to 110 psi. That's the air pressure. And it should not be leaking any air, okay? Everything that I said here, everything that's typed here, needs to be stated with the tire. We'll move on. The next thing we talk about is the rim. You're either going to have a steel or an aluminum rim. And I'm going to explain the difference. In this picture, the rim is white. It is painted white. Any rim that is painted will be a steel rim. Okay? Steel rusts. Aluminum oxidizes. Okay, there's a little bit of a difference there. An aluminum rim will be the color of the fuel tank basically on this truck. If you move back just about, you can see a fuel tank with metal straps around it, or even this front bumper here, the kind of the chromy thing. It'll be a shinier silver, okay, but most likely it'll look like that fuel tank. So let's talk about our rim, and this one's a quick one, okay? We have a steel rim. It is properly mounted and secured. It is not cracked, bent, or broken, and no illegal welds. And that's pretty much all we have to say for the rim, because we're going to move on to our lug nuts, okay? We have 10. There are 10 lug nuts, all present and tight, okay? They got to all be there. They got to all be tight, all right? And we got to tell them that. There should be no rust streaks, or if it's aluminum rim, no oxidation, which is a white powdery substance, all right, or any shiny metal, which would indicate looseness. So I will pre-trip these lug nuts again using the steel rim. So I have my 10 lug nuts, all are present and tight, all right. There should be no signs of rust streaks or shiny metal, which would indicate looseness. Now the rust streaks would be dripping down from each lug nut. They would just be dripping down the rim. You'll know it when you see it, all right? So that covers the lug nuts. The next thing we talk about is our hub and our hub seal, all right? It is metal. It is properly mounted and secured, and you can see it's in the middle of the tire. You see how I'm working myself top to bottom on this. It is properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, and has no illegal welds. It is not leaking any 90 weight gear loop, which would indicate an outer axle seal leak. Last but not least, we have our valve stem. And yes, such an insignificant little small thing, but we do have to pre-trip it, okay? We have our valve stem. It is properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, no illegal welds. It is not leaking any air, and yes, it must have a metal cap. Okay? That, my friends, takes us all the way through this part A. I'm going to go ahead one more time, and I'm going to pre-trip this from the beginning. 1 second here. We'll pre-trip it from the beginning without commentary so you can see how quick we should be going through this. Okay, we're going to start our pre-trip part A. I have my 3 identification lights, amber in color, in the center of the truck. They are properly mounted and secured. They are not cracked. They are not broken. There is no moisture behind the lenses, and they are working. These 3 lights signify that the vehicle is a minimum 8 feet wide. I have my 2 clearance lights, one on each side. They are amber in color. They are properly mounted and secured. They are not cracked or broken. There is no moisture behind the lenses. These signify the vehicle is up to 13 feet 6 inches high. I have my headlight assembly, properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, broken, no moisture behind the lenses. We have our low beam, our high beam, and our 4-function amber light. The 4 functions of the amber light are parking, running, turning, and hazard. Next, we'll move on to our belt-driven alternator, which is properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, broken, no illegal welds. All wiring is in good condition. There are no exposed, burned, or frayed wires. The belt should not be cracked, dry rotted, or torn, and have no more than a 1/4 inch free plate when pressed in the center. Next, we have our belt-driven water pump. It is properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, broken, no illegal welds, and not leaking any coolant. All hoses associated with it are properly mounted and secured, soft and pliable, not cracked or dry rotted, not leaking any coolant. The belt should not be cracked, dry rotted, or torn, and should have no more than 1/4 inch free plate when pressed in the center. Next, we have our gear-driven air compressor. We can't actually see the air compressor, but it is tucked under the frame. These are the hoses that go to it. It is properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, broken, no illegal welds, and not leaking any air. Any hoses associated with it should be soft and pliable, not cracked or dry rotted, not leaking any air. Our coolant reservoir is properly mounted and secured, not cracked or broken, not leaking any coolant. All caps are present and tight, and all hoses associated with it are soft and pliable, not cracked or dry rotted, not leaking any coolant. It should be filled to the proper level or above add and below max. Next, we have our power steering fluid reservoir. It is properly mounted and secured, not cracked or broken, not leaking any power steering fluid. All caps are present and tight, and all hoses associated with it are soft and pliable, not cracked, dry rotted, and not leaking any power steering fluid. It should be filled to the proper level, above add and below max. Next, we'll check our oil dipstick. It is properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, or broken. To check the oil, we remove the dipstick, we wipe it off, we reinsert the dipstick, we remove it again, and we read the dipstick, or the oil level. The oil level should be above add and below max. If we need to fill oil, we fill it 1 gallon at a time to prevent overfilling while the engine is cool. We do it in the cap that's marked oil. The cap is present and tight. Next, we'll move on to our steering. We have our steering shaft. Properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, no illegal welds. It is secured with a U-joint that should be well greased. We have our steering gearbox. Properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, broken, no illegal welds. It is not leaking any power steering fluid. Any hoses associated with it should be soft and pliable, not cracked or dry rotted, also not leaking. Next, we have our pitman arm, drag link, steer arm, and tie rod. They are all properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, broken, no illegal welds. They are secured with castle nuts and cotter pins. All joints are well greased. Next, we'll go to our suspension. We have our front spring hanger, our rear spring hanger, and our rear spring shackle. All are properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, broken, and no illegal welds. We have our main leaf spring, properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, broken, no illegal welds. It is secured with a U-bolt. The path of the U-bolt goes over the saddle, around the spring, and through the steer axle, secured with nuts. And we have our hydraulic shock absorber, properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, broken, and no illegal welds, not leaking any hydraulic fluid. It is secured at the top and bottom with nuts, bolts, and rubber bushings. The rubber bushings should be soft and pliable. Next, we have our brake chamber, which is properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, broken, no illegal welds, not leaking any air. All hoses associated with it should be soft and pliable, not cracked or dry rotted, also not leaking any air. Then we have our push rod and slack adjuster, which are properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, broken, and no illegal welds. The slack adjuster should be well greased and have no more than 1-inch free play with the wheels shocked and the brakes released. Next, we have our brake drum, which is properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, broken, and no illegal welds. Then we have our brake shoes and lining, which are also properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, broken, no illegal welds. There should be no less than 1/4 of an inch friction material on the brake linings. There should be no grease or oil on the inside of the drum or linings, which would indicate an inner axle seal leak. Next, we have our steer tire, which is properly mounted and secured to the rim. There are no abrasions, bulges, or cuts, and no exposed material on the sidewall. Should have a minimum of 4/32 tread depth in all major grooves. This tire cannot be recapped. Should be the same size and type across the axle. Should be filled to the manufacturer's specs or between 100 to 110 psi, and it should not be leaking any air. Our steel rim is properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, broken, with no illegal welds. All 10 lug nuts are present and tight. There are no shines, there is no signs of rust streaks or shiny metal, which would indicate looseness. Our hub and hub seal is properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, or broken, and no illegal welds. It is not leaking any 90-weight gear lube, which would indicate an outer axle seal leak. Last but not least, we have our valve stem, which is properly mounted and secured, not cracked, bent, broken, no illegal welds, and it is secured with a metal cap. That concludes part A, of our pre-trip. It was pretty simple, right? Wasn't terrible. So if you guys have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them. I will be uploading B and C for you shortly. I'm still in the process of making them. But again, if you write all this stuff down, you take your notes, you use the exact verbiage the same time every time, get it in your head. Know your parts, be able to point and identify each part as you're going through it. The examiner will slide you through, so thanks for watching, everyone.